if I leave my children at home with matches and a load of gasoline and they blow up the house, right, I can go ahead and say that I allowed my children to blow up the house because obviously they're children, they know no better. They had matches and a case of gasoline. It makes a lot of sense that they got in trouble and blew up the house.
You bet.
can blame that on me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if God creates a world and says he can make it completely orderly, he can avoid all of these terrible things, right? But he chose not to avoid those terrible things by granting us free will, as you say, which we'll get to talk to in a minute. Then we can go ahead and say that he made a mistake. If he wanted it to be perfect, he could have created this perfect. He wanted to create it imperfectly.
Nope. False.
All right. Can you explain that logic?
Sure, very simple. If I leave a 3-year-old kid with matches and gas, that's one thing. If I have an 18-year-old son and I leave gases and matches in the house, I can promise you, I am not responsible for my 18-year-old son blowing up the house and then saying, well, Dad, you left the gases and matches in the house. It's the issue of age of accountability, sir. And I can promise you, you are not a child. The thinking that you're putting out here is very good. I like it. I respect you. I can promise you, at the age of 3, you could not articulate the way you can now. So there is a big, big difference between a 3-year-old, 5-year-old with gases and matches versus you in a house by yourself with gases and matches. And I can promise you, sir, with the intelligence that you have, if you take gases and matches and blow up your home, your father and your mother are not responsible for that decision.
Certainly not.
You are. So the Bible insists, God created us human beings with a rational mind, with a conscience, and I can promise you, we ain't 3-year-olds. We are responsible.
Then when God created the first human beings, were they already 18 years old?
Yes. Adam and Eve were not born as infants.
Right,
There was
so
no
they were-
human birth canal for them to pass down.
So they were born as adults. All right, just wanted to get that cleared up in the Bible.
Well, I'm glad we cleared it fast.
All right. So let's go back to this logic before we get too far off track. So God is confined by these sort of logical realities.
He's not confined. It's part of who he is.
It's part of who he is.
Yeah. I don't think you're confined by the very good mind that you have. I think you're exercising your mind in a very exciting way. You're thinking, and you're
Right.
thinking well. And I like that. And I don't view that as a limit. I do think that if you start going blah, 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 that would be sad.
Okay. All right. So then, is there an omnipotence in God to do whatever he wants?
There is omnipotence to do whatever is consistent with his character.
But that's not omnipotence. That's,
Correct. That is not omnipotence as you would define it. Correct.
Well, that's not omnipotence how anyone would define it, I don't think.
That's not true. I am defining omnipotence when it comes to the biblical revelation of God as God has power over his creation, and he always exercises his power in conformity with his character.
All right. So what is the definition of omnipotence then?
I just gave it to you. God is all-powerful in the sense
No,
that he
not in
is
reference to
all-powerful over his creation, and he exercises that power in conformity with his character, his nature.
I'm not talking about in reference to God. I'm saying that if we're talking about written language, as of course the Bible was written in, and you were to define omnipotence as it would apply to any time we would use it, how would you define
The
omnipotence?
Bible never uses the word omnipotent.
Well, I mean, it was not written in English, but it was translated.
The Bible never uses the word omnipotent in Greek or Hebrew, which is the original languages the Bible was written in.
All right. Well, do you believe that God is omnipotent?
In the way I described, yes. Not in the way you described.
Okay. So God cannot do anything.
Correct. God cannot do anything. That's absolutely correct.
All right. Just clearing that up. All right. Also, then, is God omniscient? In other words, does he know everything?
God, because he is outside of time, sees all of history at a glance. So God sees past, present, and future at a glance.
Simultaneously.
At the same time, correct.
All right. So, given that God, right, is an eternal being or essentially atemporal, right, and he has no concept of this temporality, right? Namely, if we were eternal beings, and say we can make an example of it. For instance, let's call time, temporality, a dot, right? And God exists above the dot, right? God is eternal. He's a line segment that goes on forever. Okay, so given that we're temporal, like you're saying, and he's atemporal, what kind of concept does he have of time? And if he makes an action, can it be temporal? In other words, if I do something wrong today, how does God know that I did it wrong today and not tomorrow, given the fact that he has no concept of temporality because he's eternal?
Well, I can promise you God is more than intelligent enough to understand time. He began it in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God's creating time. Not only that, God stepped into time by becoming a human being in Jesus of Nazareth.
Sure.
So God is more than capable of understanding time, and not only understanding time, but stepping into time. And that's the mystery of the incarnation, of Jesus as God becoming a human being.
All right, so, I mean, this is talked about, especially by a lot of abstract physicists, as ET simultaneity, and basically talking about how, in the concept of eternality, right, anything that happened temporarily would be simultaneous with another event that happened temporally, because they've already happened, right? In other words, since everything has already happened, this discussion has already happened, it is essentially simultaneous with every other discussion that's ever happened.
I disagree.
If there is no time, right? There's no temporal line for God, right? Everything has already happened. You just, I mean,
No,
that's what
everything has not already happened. What does that mean?
you just explained it earlier as God knows what happened in the past, what happened now, and what happens in the future, right? Everything has already happened to God.
No, everything has not already happened. It's his perspective is outside of the dimension of time. So God sees everything at a glance because of his perspective, not because everything's already happened.